This is my father, Quang Dang. He currently lives in Salt Lake City, Utah, and helps impaired veterans with their computers. Originally, he was born and raised in Vietnam. His father worked for the Vietnam Air Force. When the Vietnam War happened, he had to flee. This is his experience.
What was life like before the war began?
Life was like any other city kid that I remember. I was only 4, so before the war, we lived a normal life. We had a house. My father was an officer in the Air Force, and I just remember life being very happy and easygoing.
What's your most clear memory of before the war began?
One of the things I remember most was we had some chickens, and I had one particular rooster that I was very fond of. In Vietnam, it's not illegal to have roosters fight each other, and so this rooster we had was undefeated, and I was really proud of that rooster.
What were your first memories of the war?
My first memory of the war, I didn't ever see any combat or anything traumatic like that. My father and my mother and my family, we flew out of Saigon, and we went to army bases as we were coming across to America. So I didn't see any violence or anything like that. I just remember the transition being a little challenging because everything was so new.
How did the war begin to affect your life?
Like I said, every day things were getting a little more desperate for the southern Vietnamese people. But as a child, had a vague, abstract concept of the war coming. It wasn't until we had to actually leave and evacuate and become refugees that the war had a direct impact on my life.
How and why did you leave Vietnam?
Like I said, my father was an officer in the South Vietnamese Air Force, and had we stayed and he been captured, he would have probably been killed, and that would have been an extreme hardship on my mother and the rest of us. My mother would have had to raise 5 kids on her own. So getting out of Vietnam was imperative for us.
What do you remember about moving?
I remember that there was always another place we had to go to. Every place we went to was temporary. So the first place we went to was an air base. I remember the soldiers and the military folks being extremely nice to us, but we were always on the move. There was always another place we had to be to.
What was the U.S. like to you?
The U.S. Again, since I was so young, everything was new, and so not. I mean, there wasn't really a lot for me to draw previously in Vietnam to compared to what we were experiencing in the U.S. Um, I mean, pretty much I've lived in Utah all my life, so for me that was just the U.S. What I experienced as I was growing up. I was just another kid in Utah.
What happened when you moved into the U.S.?
So when we moved into the U.S., first we went to a refugee camp, and in order to get out of the refugee camp, you had to have a sponsor, and a sponsor was supposed to help the family transition and become assimilated into America. So that without that sponsor, we would have not been able to come to Utah. It just so happened that that sponsor was not the best sponsor in the world, and we had to rely on other services such as Catholic Community Services and the LDS Church. And so that was really an important transition for us into America.
How was your life after the war?
Again, for me, there really wasn't anything that stood out that was extremely traumatic. The transition was traumatic in the sense that we left everything I knew, came to America, assimilated into the culture. So after the war, like I said, most of my life I've lived just as another American kid. So to me, that was life after the war.
How does it impact the life you live today?
Well, obviously all the bounty and the opportunities that we have in America made it so I could go to school. I graduated from high school. I went to university. I graduated from university. I got married. I had kids. I bought a house. I mean, pretty much I lived the American dream. And so that's my experience with life after the war.
Can you explain more on how you left Vietnam?
Since my father was an officer in the South Vietnamese Air Force, he knew that the South Vietnamese government, the war was not going well. So he made arrangements to have the family fly out. And I remember we left relatively early. We weren't caught up in that last minute evacuation that you may have seen more publicized with the news. We came to the airport, we got on a big military plane, and we flew to the Philippines. So once we got to the air base, my father had to stay behind. He was still an officer in the military, in the Air Force, and he did not feel good about abandoning his post quite yet. The South Vietnamese had not surrendered, so my father stayed behind, and my mother and 5 kids got on the big airplane, and we flew to the Philippines, and we waited for him. Well, we didn't know whether or not we would ever see him again, because he had been separated from us. And as the story goes, my father was an aviator, a navigator, and so when he went back to the air base, his military air base, and at that point the South Vietnamese had surrendered, and so all these officers were trying to get out. And what the story he tells is he went into the officers' mess hall, and they were looking for different people to fit the crew. And since he was a navigator, they immediately picked him up, and he got on a plane, and they navigated their way to the Philippine base that we happened to be at. And so that was how we became reunited.